Every detail in this story comes from real scientific research and observation. A rocket taller than a 30-story building is about to leave the ground. 5 engines, each one burning 2,500 kilograms of fuel every second. Inside, 3 men are strapped into seats the size of dinner chairs, about to travel farther than any human beings before them. A guidance computer with less memory than a modern digital watch is about to overload, twice, with the surface of the moon rising fast in the window. Fuel is running low. Seconds are being counted out loud in a room 400,000 kilometers away. One man is about to step onto ground no human hand has ever touched. 600 million people are about to watch it happen, live, at the same moment, on the same night. A mirror will be left behind on that ground, and scientists are still bouncing lasers off it more than half a century later. 3 men will fall into the Pacific Ocean in a metal capsule and then be sealed inside a trailer for 3 weeks because no one on Earth is certain yet what the moon might carry home with it. A flag will be raised in a place with no wind, no air, and no sound to carry the sound of raising it. And 11 words, spoken from 250,000 miles away, will be heard by more people than any sentence in human history before them. This did not happen in a story. It happened in July of 1969. This is Quiet Science at Bedtime. If this is your kind of story, a subscribe means everything right now. Every fact in tonight's story is grounded in real mission data, real recorded transmissions, and documented scientific research. Just relax and feel free to let this play as you drift off to sleep. Now, let us begin. In 1961, the United States had not yet put a single astronaut into orbit around the Earth. President John F. Kennedy stood before Congress and set a goal that, by the engineering standards of the time, bordered on reckless: land a man on the moon and return him safely before the decade was out. It required building, from nothing, a rocket larger than any that had ever flown, a guidance system accurate enough to hit a target 384,000 kilometers away, and a spacecraft capable of surviving a landing on a world with no atmosphere to slow it down. 8 years later, on the morning of July 16th, 1969, that engineering effort stood assembled on a launch pad in Florida, fueled and ready. The Saturn V rocket stood on Pad 39A at Kennedy Space Center, 111 meters tall, taller than the Statue of Liberty, measured from the ground to the torch. Fully fueled, it weighed just under 3,000 metric tons, most of that weight in liquid oxygen and refined kerosene, packed into 3 separate stages, stacked one on top of the other. At its base sat 5 F-1 engines, the most powerful single-chamber liquid-fueled rocket engines ever flown, each one capable of producing 1.5 million pounds of thrust. At 9:32 in the morning, Eastern Daylight Time, those 5 engines ignited. An estimated 1 million spectators had gathered along the Florida coastline in the days before launch, packing beaches, causeways, and roadside shoulders for kilometers in every direction around Kennedy Space Center, drawn by the knowledge that whatever happened that morning would be witnessed by history, regardless of whether they personally saw it in person. Among them were journalists from dozens of countries, members of Congress, foreign dignitaries, and ordinary families who had driven through the night to claim a view of the pad. In the first seconds after ignition, the Saturn V burned through its own fuel at a staggering rate. Combined, the 5 F1 engines consumed approximately 15 metric tons of propellant every second, kerosene and liquid oxygen, mixed and ignited continuously, producing a combined thrust of 7.5 million pounds. It was enough force to lift the entire assembled rocket, spacecraft included, off the ground at a rate that felt, to the 3 men strapped inside, less like flying and more like being struck repeatedly from below. Commander Neil Armstrong sat in the left couch of the command module at the very top of the stack. To his right sat Michael Collins, the command module pilot, and beside him, Edwin Buzz Aldrin, the lunar module pilot. All three had flown in space before, Armstrong on Gemini 8, Collins on Gemini 10, Aldrin on Gemini 12, but nothing in their prior flights had prepared them for the specific violence of a Saturn V launch. The rocket did not simply push upward. It shook, vibrated, and roared with a sound so loud that observers 3.5 kilometers away reported feeling the pressure of it against their chests. For launch and re-entry, all 3 astronauts wore a lighter, less bulky version of the spacesuit than the one Armstrong and Aldrin would later use on the lunar surface. A garment still built from multiple layers, including an inner comfort layer, a pressure restraint layer of coated nylon, and an outer layer designed to resist tearing and abrasion, though without the additional thermal and micrometeoroid protection the surface suits would require. Even this lighter configuration remained pressurized independently of the cabin, a redundant safeguard in case of a sudden loss of cabin pressure during the violence of ascent. None of the 3 men could see the ground falling away beneath them. Their windows faced upward toward space, not downward toward Florida. What they could see was the sky changing color, the deep blue of the atmosphere thinning, darkening, giving way to black in a matter of minutes rather than hours. The Saturn V's first stage, the CIC, burned for only 2 minutes and 41 seconds before its fuel was exhausted, and it separated, falling back toward the Atlantic Ocean. By that point, the rocket had already carried the crew to an altitude of 68 kilometers and a velocity of nearly 10,000 kilometers per hour. The second stage ignited almost immediately, 5 J2 engines burning liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, a more efficient but less explosively powerful combination than the kerosene-fueled first stage. This stage carried the spacecraft the rest of the way out of the thickest part of Earth's atmosphere, burning for just over 6 minutes before it, 2 separated and fell away, its job finished. What remained was a single third stage, the CEF-EB, along with the command module Columbia, the service module attached behind it, and the lunar module Eagle, folded and stored inside a protective housing just below. The SAB's single J2 engine fired for 2.5 minutes, inserting the spacecraft into a parking orbit around Earth, a circular path at roughly 190 kilometers altitude, moving at approximately 7.8 kilometers per second. At that speed, the crew circled the entire planet once every 88 minutes. For the next hour and a half, Apollo 11 orbited the Earth twice, while ground controllers in Houston verified every system aboard the spacecraft: electrical power, life support, guidance, communications, before committing the crew to the much longer and far less reversible journey ahead. Then, over the Pacific Ocean, the Savings engine reignited. This second burn, called translunar injection, lasted 5 minutes and 48 seconds. It was the maneuver that would take Apollo 11 out of Earth's orbit entirely, accelerating the spacecraft to just over 10.8 kilometers per second, fast enough to escape the pull of Earth's gravity and begin falling instead toward the moon. The math behind this burn had to be extraordinarily precise. A velocity error of even a few meters per second, uncorrected, could mean missing the moon by thousands of kilometers, or worse, arriving on a trajectory that would never bring the crew home. It did not miss. Inside the spacecraft, the three astronauts felt the engine's push fade to silence as the burn completed and the S5B's job was done. What followed was a maneuver that on paper sounds almost delicate for a mission of this scale: transposition and docking. The command and service module, Columbia, separated from the spent third stage, turned 180 degrees using its own small thrusters, and flew back toward the same stage it had just left, this time nose first, toward the lunar module Eagle, still tucked inside its protective panels. Michael Collins, at the controls, guided Columbia's docking probe into Eagle's docking collar with a closing speed of less than 1/10 of a meter per second, a contact softer than a gentle handshake, captured on film by a camera mounted in Columbia's hatch window. 12 latches engaged automatically, locking the two spacecraft together into a single rigid structure. Eagle was pulled free of the spent third stage, and the S4B, no longer needed, was sent on a separate trajectory that would carry it past the moon and into a long, uncontrolled orbit around the sun. What remained, moving now at over 10 kilometers per second and carrying three men roughly 384,000 kilometers from home, was the combined spacecraft that would carry two of them to the lunar surface and all three of them back. Inside Columbia, the environment had settled into something closer to routine. The command module's interior volume measured just over 6 cubic meters, smaller than a small car's interior, shared among three men, their equipment, their food, and the instrument panels that monitored every system keeping them alive. Cabin pressure was maintained at roughly 1/3 of sea-level atmospheric pressure, using pure oxygen rather than the nitrogen-oxygen mixture found in Earth's air, a design choice that simplified the spacecraft's life support systems considerably, though it came with its own risks that NASA had learned from, tragically, 2 years earlier. The silence outside the hull was absolute. There was no air to carry sound, no atmosphere to scatter light into a blue sky. Through Columbia's 5 small windows, the stars did not twinkle the way they do from Earth's surface. Twinkling is caused by atmospheric turbulence bending starlight as it passes through the air, and in the vacuum of space, there was no air left to bend it. The stars simply held still, sharp points of light against a black that had no gradient, no horizon, no beginning or end. Earth itself, receding slowly behind them, had already begun to shrink. In the hours after translunar injection, its apparent size in the window dropped from something that filled the view to something that could be covered, eventually, by a single thumb held at arm's length. It was the first time in the history of the species that human eyes were far enough away to see the whole planet at once, not a horizon, not a landscape, but a complete sphere, blue and white, suspended against nothing. 3 days of travel lay ahead before the moon's gravity would take over from Earth's, and the spacecraft would begin, for the first time, to fall towards something other than home. The 3 men aboard had arrived at this moment through very different paths, though all 3 shared one thing in common. Each had spent the better part of a decade being tested, evaluated, and retested for precisely this kind of mission. Neil Armstrong had been a naval aviator before becoming a test pilot, flying experimental aircraft, including the X-15 rocket plane, to the edge of space itself, reaching altitudes above 60 kilometers, years before he ever wore a NASA spacesuit. Michael Collins had trained as a fighter pilot and later became one of a small number of astronauts entrusted with the command module pilot role, the person who would remain in lunar orbit alone while his crewmates descended to the surface below. Buzz Aldrin held a doctorate in astronautics from MIT with a thesis focused specifically on orbital rendezvous techniques, the very mathematics that would bring Eagle back to Columbia after the landing. To keep the spacecraft's thermal environment stable, Mission Control instructed the crew to initiate what was called the passive thermal control mode, nicknamed by the astronauts the barbecue roll. Without an atmosphere to distribute heat evenly, one side of the spacecraft facing the sun would otherwise climb to temperatures exceeding 120 degrees Celsius, while the opposite side, facing away, could drop below negative 100 degrees Celsius. To prevent this extreme imbalance from warping components or stressing the hull unevenly, Columbia was set into a slow, continuous rotation, approximately one full turn every 20 minutes, so that no single surface remained in direct sunlight or in shadow for very long. Inside the cabin, this rotation was nearly imperceptible to the astronauts, who had no fixed up or down to judge it against. Navigation across the 250,000 kilometers of empty space between Earth and the Moon relied on a combination of ground-based tracking and onboard instruments. NASA's tracking stations, spread across the globe in places like Goldstone in California, Madrid in Spain, and Honeysuckle Creek in Australia, measured the spacecraft's position using radio signals, calculating its trajectory to within a precision of a few kilometers across hundreds of thousands of kilometers of travel. On board, the crew carried out star sightings using a sextant built directly into Columbia's navigation system, aligning it against known stars to verify the spacecraft's orientation independently of any signal from Earth, a redundancy built in case communication with Mission Control was ever lost. For most of the journey, there was very little for the crew to actively do. The burns had been calculated, the trajectory had been set. What remained was hours of monitoring instruments, periodic status reports relayed back to Houston, and long stretches of near silence, broken occasionally by static-laced radio chatter or the quiet hum of the spacecraft's own systems. At one point during the outbound journey, the crew broadcast a live television transmission back to Earth, showing viewers the interior of the spacecraft and a view of the receding planet through Columbia's windows, one of the first times an ordinary television audience had seen, with their own eyes, footage of Earth from deep space. Meals during transit consisted largely of freeze-dried, rehydratable food packaged in flexible plastic pouches, each one fitted with a valve the crew could use to inject hot or cold water directly from the spacecraft's own supply before kneading the pouch to mix the contents. The menu had improved considerably since NASA's earliest crewed flights, now including items like shrimp cocktail, chicken salad, and even a form of bite-sized, coated brownies designed to minimize the crumbs that could otherwise drift loose and interfere with sensitive equipment in a weightless cabin. The onboard guidance computer, called the Apollo Guidance Computer, represented one of the most advanced pieces of technology of its era, though by later standards its capabilities were remarkably modest. It contained roughly 72 kilobytes of read-only memory and 4 kilobytes of erasable memory, a combined storage capacity smaller than a single modern text message multiplied many times over, and yet sufficient to calculate the precise trajectories, engine burns, and attitude corrections required to navigate to another world and back. It had been built using an early form of integrated circuit, and its software had been painstakingly written and tested by a team at MIT's Instrumentation Laboratory, led by Margaret Hamilton, whose work on the guidance software's error handling routines would prove critical in the days ahead, though none of the crew yet knew how critical it would become. As the spacecraft continued to fall through the vacuum between two worlds, the balance of gravitational influence began to shift, almost imperceptibly at first. Near Earth, the planet's gravity dominated completely, decelerating the spacecraft as it climbed away. But roughly 346,000 kilometers from Earth, a boundary sometimes called the point of equigravisphere, where the gravitational pull of the Moon first exceeds that of Earth, the spacecraft's trajectory quietly changed character. It stopped decelerating away from Earth and began, instead, to accelerate toward the Moon. None of the astronauts felt this transition directly. There was no jolt, no sensation of a switch being thrown. The only evidence was in the numbers relayed from mission control, and in the growing size of the Moon itself in Columbia's windows, no longer a distant gray disk, but a world with visible texture, its ancient impact basins and mountain ranges beginning to resolve into something the crew could study in detail for the first time. 4 mid-course correction burns had been planned for the outbound journey, small firings of Columbia's own engine designed to fine-tune the trajectory as new tracking data came in from Earth. In the end, the spacecraft's initial trajectory, set by the translunar injection burn, had been calculated with such precision that only one of the 4 planned corrections was actually necessary, a 9-second burn early in the flight that adjusted the spacecraft's path by a fraction of a degree. The other 3 were canceled, one by one, as ground controllers confirmed that Apollo 11 was tracking almost exactly along its intended course, a testament to both the accuracy of the original burn and the mathematics behind it. During the first 2 days of transit, the crew conducted several television broadcasts back to Earth, culminating in a longer transmission on July 18th, in which they gave viewers an extended tour of both spacecraft, Columbia, where they had been living, and Eagle, still docked nose to nose with it, its spindly landing legs folded against its body, waiting for the moment it would be needed. Aldrin floated through the connecting tunnel between the 2 spacecraft to show viewers the lunar module's interior, a cramped 2-person cabin with no seats, designed for astronauts who would stand, secured by restraints, for the entire descent and ascent. Eagle itself was a machine built for exactly one environment and one purpose. Unlike Columbia, which had to survive the friction and heat of re-entry into Earth's atmosphere, Eagle would never touch Earth's air. Its hull was built almost paper-thin in places, its designers stripping away every gram of unnecessary mass because every kilogram of structure was a kilogram of fuel or equipment the spacecraft could not carry instead. It consisted of 2 separate stages, a descent stage with a single throttleable engine and 4 landing legs that would remain on the lunar surface permanently once its job was done, and an ascent stage, a smaller pressurized cabin sitting on top that would later use the descent stage as its own launch pad to lift back off the Moon. Grumman, the aerospace company responsible for Eagle's design and construction, had built the spacecraft's pressurized cabin walls from aluminum alloy measured in fractions of a millimeter in places, thin enough that engineers reportedly joked the hull could be punctured with a screwdriver, a design choice that made sense only because Eagle would never need to survive the aerodynamic stresses or re-entry heating that shaped every design decision behind Columbia's far sturdier hull. Every unnecessary gram removed from Eagle's structure translated directly into additional propellant, additional equipment, or additional margin for the descent and ascent it alone would need to perform. As the spacecraft continued its approach, the physical experience of weightlessness had by this point in the mission become almost unremarkable to the crew. In freefall, with no rocket engine firing and no atmosphere to create drag, an object inside the spacecraft did not experience a force pulling it in any direction. A checklist left unsecured would drift gently across the cabin. A drop of water released from a drinking bag would hold its shape as a nearly perfect sphere, surface tension pulling it into the most efficient geometric form, uninterrupted by gravity's usual downward pull. The astronauts had trained extensively for this environment in aircraft flying parabolic arcs back on Earth, brief windows of weightlessness lasting only 20 or 30 seconds at a time. Now, they had been living inside it continuously for more than 2 days. The moon, by the third day, filled almost the entire window. Its surface, lit at a low angle by the sun, showed a landscape scarred by billions of years of impacts, craters overlapping craters, some so old their rims had softened and nearly vanished, others sharp-edged and clearly more recent, their ejected material still visible as pale streaks radiating outward across the darker surface. There was no atmosphere on the moon to erode these features, no wind, no rain, no flowing water to smooth them over time. What the crew was looking at was, in a very real sense, a record, nearly the entire visible history of impacts across the inner solar system, preserved and largely undisturbed, layered onto a single small world. Ahead of the crew now lay the maneuver that would determine everything that followed, a precisely timed engine burn to slow the spacecraft enough for the moon's gravity to capture it into orbit, rather than letting it continue past on a free return trajectory back toward Earth. That burn would have to occur on the far side of the moon, out of radio contact with mission control, with the crew entirely alone to execute it and confirm, only afterward, whether it had succeeded. Passing behind the moon, where its own bulk blocked every signal to and from Earth, Columbia's main engine ignited. This burn, called lunar orbit insertion, lasted 6 minutes and 2 seconds, firing the spacecraft's engine directly against its own direction of travel to shed enough velocity that the moon's gravity could hold it captive rather than let it slingshot past. Mission control in Houston could do nothing but wait. For roughly 35 minutes, as the spacecraft passed behind the moon, the lunar body itself blocked every radio signal between Earth and the crew, a communications blackout built into the mission by simple geometry, unavoidable no matter how the trajectory was planned. When Columbia's radio signal reappeared on schedule, flight controllers in Houston confirmed what the numbers had predicted. The burn had succeeded. Apollo 11 was now in orbit around the moon, its path settling into an ellipse that would, over the following orbits, be trimmed into a nearly circular path at roughly 110 kilometers altitude. For the first time in human history, 3 people were circling another world, close enough to see its surface features passing beneath them in detail that no telescope on Earth, however powerful, had ever managed to resolve. Below them, an entirely alien geography unrolled. The lunar surface divides broadly into 2 kinds of terrain, distinguishable even to an untrained eye: the dark, relatively smooth plains called Maria, Latin for seas, though no liquid water has ever filled them, and the brighter, heavily cratered highlands that make up most of the moon's surface area. The Maria are ancient lava flows, formed when asteroid impacts billions of years ago cracked deep enough into the moon's crust to release molten rock from beneath, which then spread out and cooled into vast basaltic plains. The highlands, by contrast, are older still, dating back to the moon's earliest formation, their surfaces so heavily battered by impacts over 4.5 billion years that almost no original terrain remains untouched. Their target lay within one of the Maria, the Sea of Tranquility, chosen not for its scenic qualities, but for engineering reasons. Its terrain was relatively flat and free of the deep craters and boulder fields that made other regions of the moon far riskier to attempt a landing. Mission planners had spent years analyzing photographs taken by earlier robotic missions, the Ranger, Surveyor, and Lunar Orbiter programs, cataloging slopes, crater densities, and surface composition across dozens of candidate sites before narrowing the choice down to this one relatively unremarkable stretch of ancient lava plain. Beyond terrain safety, the site selection process weighed several additional factors: a free return trajectory that would allow Columbia to loop safely back toward Earth, even if a critical engine burn failed, favorable lighting conditions during the scheduled landing window that would cast long enough shadows to reveal surface hazards without leaving the site in complete darkness, and a latitude close enough to the lunar equator to keep fuel requirements for the descent within manageable limits. Of the roughly 30 candidate sites considered in earlier surveys, only 5 ultimately satisfied every one of these constraints simultaneously, and the Sea of Tranquility was judged on balance the safest among them. As Columbia completed its orbital revolutions, circling the moon roughly once every 2 hours, the crew began the methodical work of preparing Eagle for its journey to the surface. Buzz Aldrin floated through the docking tunnel connecting the 2 spacecraft, entering the lunar module to begin powering up its systems, checking each one against a checklist that had been rehearsed dozens of times in simulators back on Earth, but never before under these exact conditions, genuinely orbiting the moon with the real surface passing beneath the real windows. Every switch, every gauge, every readout had a specific, memorized meaning, and every one of them had to agree with what the checklist expected before the crew would commit to separation. Cabin pressure inside Eagle had to build correctly. The guidance computer had to align itself with Columbia's own navigation platform, transferring position and velocity data between the 2 spacecraft so that Eagle would begin its descent already knowing, to within a small margin of error, exactly where it was and how fast it was moving. On the far side of the moon, once again, the crew fell out of contact with Earth. It was during one of these blackout periods, orbit after orbit, that final checks were completed and the last preparations made. Then, coming back around to the near side, with radio contact restored, Michael Collins remained alone inside Columbia, while Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin sealed themselves inside Eagle. The hatch between the 2 spacecraft was closed. The docking latches, the same ones that had held the 2 vehicles together since the earliest hours of the mission, released. Eagle drifted free. For a brief period, the 2 spacecraft flew in loose formation, close enough for Collins, still aboard Columbia, to visually inspect Eagle's exterior, checking that its 4 spindly landing legs had deployed correctly, locked into position, ready to absorb the shock of touchdown. He relayed his observations to Armstrong and Aldrin by radio. The legs looked good. Nothing appeared damaged or out of place. It was a simple visual check, performed by eye through a spacecraft window, and it was also the only inspection Eagle's landing gear would receive before it was asked to support 2 astronauts and a spacecraft on the surface of another world. With the inspection complete, the 2 spacecraft separated further, moving on to slightly different orbital paths. Columbia remained in its stable, roughly circular orbit at about 110 kilometers altitude, with Collins now alone aboard it, a solitude that would last for the better part of a full day, circling the moon roughly once every 2 hours, sometimes passing behind its far side and losing contact with both Earth and his own crewmates on the surface below, in a silence more complete than almost any human being had ever experienced. Eagle, meanwhile, fired its own descent engine briefly, a maneuver called the Descent Orbit Insertion Burn, lowering its orbital path into an ellipse that would bring it down to a minimum altitude of just over 15 kilometers above the lunar surface, at its closest point, the altitude from which the true descent to the surface would begin. Inside Eagle's cramped cabin, Armstrong and Aldrin stood rather than sat, secured to the floor by restraints, positioned in front of triangular windows, angled downward so that the approaching surface would be visible throughout the descent. Between them sat the guidance computer's display and keyboard interface, along with an array of switches and circuit breakers that controlled every system aboard the small craft: engine throttle, propellant valves, radar systems, communication links back to both Columbia and Earth. The lunar module's descent engine was, by the standards of the era, a remarkable piece of engineering. A single engine, throttleable across a wide range of thrust levels, a capability almost no other rocket engine of the period possessed. Most rocket engines of the 1960s operated at full thrust or not at all. Building an engine that could be smoothly and reliably adjusted, from nearly full power down to a fraction of it, was essential for a controlled landing where the spacecraft would need to slow gradually rather than all at once, and where the pilot would need fine control over the final delicate meters of descent. As Eagle coasted toward the low point of its new orbit, both astronauts ran through final checklists, confirming the alignment of the guidance platform, the status of the landing radar that would soon begin measuring altitude and velocity relative to the approaching surface, and the propellant quantities remaining in the descent stage's tanks. Every number had to match what the checklist expected. Every system had to report ready. 15 kilometers below them, and closing, lay a world no living person had ever stood on. The powered descent to the surface was about to begin, a maneuver that would take just under 13 minutes from start to touchdown, and that would require Eagle's guidance computer, its engine, and its 2-person crew to perform more precisely and under more pressure than at any other point in the mission so far. Behind them, Columbia continued its quiet orbit, carrying Michael Collins alone across the near side of the moon and then away into the blackout of the far side, where no signal from Earth and no signal from Eagle could reach him at all. He would orbit that way, alternating between contact and silence for the better part of the next day, waiting for the moment his 2 crewmates would either return to him or not. Every 90 minutes or so, Collins passed back into view of Earth, and Mission Control would relay whatever updates they had. In between, there was only the spacecraft's own systems, the slow rotation of the lunar surface beneath him, and a solitude that has, in the decades since, become its own small chapter in the story. A single human being, farther from every other living person than anyone in history before him, waiting in orbit while 2 others attempted something that had never been done. Below, in Eagle, Armstrong's hand rested near the controls that would soon take manual authority over the ship's final approach. The descent had not yet begun in earnest, but the numbers were aligning. The systems were reporting green, and the low point of the orbit, the moment the engine would ignite and the true descent would start, was now only minutes away. Collins's solitude aboard Columbia was not in fact idle time. Mission planners had given him a substantial workload of his own, most of it centered on photographing the lunar surface below, documenting candidate landing sites for future missions, capturing the terrain in high resolution using a 70mm Hasselblad camera fitted with a long lens, and cataloging surface features that ground-based telescopes, hampered by Earth's own atmosphere, could never resolve with the same clarity. Every pass over the near side gave him a fresh window of several minutes to work through a prepared list of targets before the moon's curve carried them out of view again. He also carried out navigation tasks independent of Eagle's own systems, tracking landmarks on the lunar surface through Columbia's sextant to refine the spacecraft's orbital parameters, data that would later help refine the precise trajectory Eagle would need to fly in order to rendezvous with him again after the surface mission was complete. In effect, Collins was not simply waiting. He was quietly building the navigational foundation that his crewmates' safe return would eventually depend on. The communications blackout itself, the periods when the moon's own bulk stood directly between the spacecraft and Earth, followed simple, unavoidable geometry. Radio signals travel in straight lines, and the moon, roughly 3,500 kilometers in diameter, presented an obstacle no transmitter could see around. During each of Collins' orbits, this blackout lasted for a predictable stretch of time, long enough that mission control back in Houston had learned, over the preceding orbits, almost exactly when to expect his signal to vanish and exactly when to expect it to return. In later interviews, Collins would describe this particular solitude in terms that were less about isolation and more about a kind of intense focus. 3 days of training and checklists, reducing the experience, moment to moment, to a series of specific, immediate tasks rather than an abstract sense of distance from every other human being alive. Still, the numbers themselves carried their own weight. At certain points in his orbit, Collins was separated from the nearest other human beings, his own crewmates, ascending toward the surface below by distances greater than any human being had ever been separated from another living person, a fact he was well aware of, and one that mission planners had simply built into the architecture of the flight without dwelling on it further. Meanwhile, aboard Eagle, the descent orbit had carried Armstrong and Aldrin to the final approach of their low point, a location on the far side of the moon, still out of contact with Houston, where the descent engine would need to ignite precisely on schedule, without any possibility of a last-minute confirmation from the ground. The burn had to begin and had to succeed entirely on the strength of onboard systems and preloaded commands. The landing radar, mounted on the underside of Eagle's descent stage, would not activate until later in the approach, once the spacecraft had descended low enough for its beams to reflect usefully off the surface below. Until then, the spacecraft's guidance relied entirely on inertial measurements, a set of gyroscopes and accelerometers tracking every small change in velocity and orientation since the platform had last been aligned, integrating those changes continuously to calculate, moment by moment, where the spacecraft believed itself to be. Small drift errors, accumulated over hours of orbital flight, were an unavoidable feature of any inertial system. This was precisely why the crew had performed star sightings and platform alignments repeatedly throughout the mission, anchoring the accumulated guesswork of the inertial system back against the fixed, known positions of real stars, correcting for drift before it could grow large enough to matter. By the time Eagle reached its final orbital low point, its guidance platform had been aligned and realigned enough times that mission planners were confident its position estimate was accurate to within a very small margin, though small, at orbital velocities still meant a margin measured in real, physical kilometers. For these alignments, both spacecraft's guidance computers relied on a fixed catalog of 37 navigation stars, each one selected in advance for its brightness and its position relative to the others, giving the crew reliable reference points, regardless of which direction the spacecraft happened to be facing at any given moment. Sighting two of these stars through the onboard optics and confirming the angle between them against what the computer expected was often enough to detect and correct even a small accumulated drift before it had any meaningful effect on the mission's outcome. Radiation exposure was another quiet consideration running beneath the entire mission, rarely discussed openly with the public at the time, but carefully tracked by flight surgeons on the ground. Outside the protection of Earth's magnetic field, which deflects much of the charged particle radiation streaming from the sun and from deeper in the galaxy, the crew were exposed to significantly higher radiation levels than they would have experienced on Earth's surface. Dosimeters carried aboard both spacecraft measured this exposure continuously. For a mission of this duration, the accumulated dose remained within levels considered medically acceptable, a calculated risk mission planners had weighed against the goal of the flight, though it was a risk that would only grow more significant for crews on longer missions in the decades that followed. As Eagle's orbit carried it back around toward the near side of the moon, toward the point where the descent engine was scheduled to ignite, both astronauts ran through one final verification of their guidance computer's program state, confirming that the correct sequence, labeled Program 63 in the flight software, was loaded and ready to take the spacecraft through the first phase of its descent. Behind that number sat thousands of individual lines of code, written and tested over years, now about to be executed for the first time under real conditions, guiding two men and a spacecraft toward a landing that had never once, in the true sense, been rehearsed. Simulations on Earth had come close. Astronauts had trained in a machine called the Lunar Landing Training Vehicle, an ungainly aircraft that used a jet engine to cancel out 5/6 of Earth's gravity, approximating as closely as any machine on the ground could the handling characteristics of a spacecraft descending through 1/6 gravity toward the lunar surface. Armstrong himself had ejected from one of these vehicles the year before, seconds before it crashed and burned on a Houston training field, an incident that underscored just how unforgiving the actual descent would be if something went wrong at the wrong moment. But even the best simulation remained, by definition, a simulation, conducted under Earth's atmosphere, Earth's gravity, and Earth's forgiving margin for error. Nothing on the ground could fully replicate a real descent through vacuum onto a surface with no prior human footprint, under conditions where a single serious malfunction at the wrong altitude would leave no time and no room to recover. The descent stage itself, the lower half of Eagle that would remain behind on the surface after the mission was complete, carried its own quiet engineering story. Its structure used a lattice of aluminum alloy, chosen for its strength relative to its mass, wrapped in multiple layers of thin, reflective insulation designed to manage the extreme temperature swings of lunar space, swings that, without an atmosphere to moderate them, could range from over 120 degrees Celsius in direct sunlight to below -150 degrees Celsius in shadow, sometimes across distances of only a few meters on the spacecraft's own hull. The engineers who built it had to account not just for the forces of launch and landing, but for the simple, patient stress of extreme heat expanding one side of the structure while extreme cold contracted the other, hour after hour, for the full duration of the mission. Its 4 landing legs, folded flat against the descent stage for the entire outbound journey, had deployed and locked into position hours earlier, each one tipped with a round metal footpad roughly 94 centimeters across, designed to spread the spacecraft's weight across a wider area and reduce the risk of sinking into loose surface material. Beneath each footpad hung a thin metal probe, extending downward by just over 1.5 meters, a simple mechanical sensor that, upon touching the surface, would illuminate a blue light on the instrument panel inside the cabin, the signal Armstrong would use to know precisely when to cut the descent engine during the final moment of touchdown. No one aboard Eagle, and no one on the ground in Houston, could say with certainty exactly how firm or how soft the lunar surface at the Sea of Tranquility would prove to be. Earlier robotic missions, the Surveyor landers, which had touched down years before and transmitted data on surface bearing strength, had gone a long way toward resolving early fears that the moon's surface might be covered in a deep layer of fine, unconsolidated dust capable of swallowing a spacecraft whole. But those measurements had come from a handful of specific sites, thousands of kilometers from Tranquility itself, and a healthy uncertainty remained about exactly what Eagle's footpads would encounter when they finally made contact. That answer was now only minutes away. As Eagle completed the final stretch of its orbit, closing in on the moment its descent engine was due to fire, both astronauts fell into the practiced rhythm of a checklist they had rehearsed more times than either could easily count, calling out numbers, confirming switch positions, cross-checking each other's readouts against the flight plan taped to the instrument panel in front of them. Radio contact with Houston, lost during the far side of the orbit, would return just before the burn was scheduled to begin, giving Mission Control a brief window to confirm the crew was go for the maneuver before losing the ability to influence it in any way at all. From this point forward, everything that happened would happen in real time, 13 minutes from ignition to touchdown, with no ground controller able to reach out and adjust a single control from a distance of 384,000 kilometers. Whatever occurred in the descent would occur because of decisions made, in the moment, by 2 men standing in a spacecraft the size of a small closet, guided by a computer with less processing power than would later be found in a simple calculator, trusting years of training and thousands of hours of engineering to carry them the rest of the way down. The descent engine ignited on schedule at an altitude of just over 15 kilometers above the lunar surface. For the first several minutes, the burn was almost entirely automatic, controlled by the guidance computer executing a preloaded program designed to shed the bulk of Eagle's remaining orbital velocity as efficiently as possible. This phase, known to the flight controllers as the braking phase, oriented the spacecraft with its windows facing away from the surface and its engine bell facing the direction of travel, using the full force of the throttled engine to slow the craft from its orbital speed of roughly 5,500 kilometers per hour down towards something survivable for a landing. Neither Armstrong nor Aldrin could see the surface directly during this phase. Instead, they monitored a stream of numbers from the guidance computer, cross-checking altitude, velocity, and fuel, remaining against a set of printed reference cards taped to the instrument panel, watching for any deviation that might signal a problem developing faster than either of them could otherwise perceive it. Roughly 6 minutes into the burn, an alarm sounded inside the cabin. The guidance computer displayed a code, 1202. Neither astronaut had encountered this specific alarm during training, and for a handful of seconds, the meaning of the number was unclear to the two men whose landing now depended on understanding it correctly. Aldrin read the code aloud to Mission Control. In Houston, inside the Mission Operations Control Room, a young guidance officer named Steve Bales had less than 20 seconds to determine whether the alarm indicated a fatal problem requiring an immediate abort or something the computer could safely work through on its own. 20 seconds to decide the fate of the entire descent. The 1202 alarm indicated what engineers called an executive overflow, the guidance computer's processor, tasked with running multiple programs simultaneously to manage navigation, engine control, and radar data all at once, had become briefly overloaded, unable to complete every scheduled task within its allotted time. Critically, the software running the computer had been designed years earlier by Margaret Hamilton's team at MIT with a built-in ability to recognize this kind of overload and respond by discarding lower priority tasks automatically, preserving only the calculations essential to keeping the spacecraft on course. Bales, drawing on backroom analysis conducted only weeks earlier during a nearly identical alarm encountered in a training simulation, gave the call, "Go." The alarm did not indicate a computer failure. It indicated a computer successfully protecting itself, shedding excess workload exactly as it had been designed to. The descent continued. A second related alarm, 1201, sounded moments later, triggered by the same underlying cause. Each time, the guidance computer recovered within a second or two, discarding lower priority calculations and continuing to execute the essential guidance functions without interruption. The root cause, engineers would determine after the mission, traced back to a checklist procedure that had left a rendezvous radar switch in a position that caused it to send unnecessary data to the computer throughout the descent, adding a small but persistent extra burden to a processor already working at its limit. Underlying all of this, a separate instrument had already begun doing quiet, essential work of its own. Eagle's landing radar, mounted on the underside of the descent stage, activated automatically once the spacecraft descended below roughly 15 kilometers altitude. Unlike the inertial guidance system, which calculated position and velocity by continuously integrating small measured changes since the last known alignment, the landing radar measured altitude and velocity directly, bouncing radio pulses off the actual lunar surface below and timing their return. This distinction mattered enormously. Inertial systems, however carefully calibrated, accumulate small errors over time, drifting further from truth the longer they operate without correction. The landing radar offered no such drift. Its measurements referenced the real physical surface Eagle was falling toward, moment by moment, and fed that data directly into the guidance computer to correct and refine the inertial system's own running estimate. Two different ways of knowing where you are, checked constantly against each other. For much of the descent, the two systems' readings tracked closely, differing only by small margins well within expected tolerances. The guidance computer used this radar data continuously, updating its own estimate of Eagle's true altitude and descent rate, feeding corrected numbers into the automatic control loop that had, until this point, been flying the spacecraft with only minimal input from either astronaut. As Eagle passed through 8 kilometers altitude and continued dropping, the spacecraft rotated to bring its windows around to face more directly toward the approaching surface, giving Armstrong his first extended visual look at the terrain below during what mission planners called the approach phase. What he saw did not entirely match what the guidance computer's programmed trajectory was targeting. The computer, following its preloaded landing site coordinates, was steering Eagle toward a location that, as it grew closer, revealed itself to be scattered with boulders, some the size of small cars, surrounding the rim of a sharp-edged crater roughly 180 meters across, later informally named West Crater. Landing among that debris field risked toppling the spacecraft on touchdown, or damaging a landing leg against a rock hidden until the final seconds of descent. There would be no second attempt if the first one failed here. Armstrong made the decision to take semi-manual control of the spacecraft, using a hand controller to adjust Eagle's horizontal velocity, while the computer continued managing the vertical descent rate and throttle automatically. Flying the spacecraft this way, adjusting its trajectory by eye in real time, he guided Eagle past the boulder field, extending the descent further downrange than originally planned, searching the terrain below for a stretch of relatively flat, clear ground. Every extra second spent searching for a landing site consumed propellant that had been allocated for exactly this kind of contingency, but was not unlimited. In Houston, flight controllers tracked the dwindling fuel reserve through a series of calls relayed to the crew, each one marking a specific threshold of propellant remaining before an abort would become mandatory, regardless of how close to the surface Eagle had come. At an altitude of roughly 30 meters, moving forward and slightly sideways as Armstrong continued his manual search for open ground, a call came from Mission Control. 60 seconds of fuel remaining. Not 60 seconds until empty, but 60 seconds until the tanks reached a level considered the final safe margin for a controlled abort, a threshold below which an emergency ascent could no longer be guaranteed to succeed cleanly. The surface, by now, filled almost the entire window. Aldrin called out altitude and velocity readings in a steady, practiced rhythm, drawn from the landing radar, now feeding live data into the guidance computer, descending at just over half a meter per second, drifting slowly forward, still searching for the final touchdown point. Lunar dust, kicked up by the descent engine's exhaust as the spacecraft closed the final meters, began to obscure the surface directly below, scattering outward in every direction across a landscape with no atmosphere to slow or settle it. A second call came from Mission Control. 30 seconds. Neither astronaut responded verbally. There was no time and no need. Both men understood exactly what the number meant and exactly what remained to be done in the seconds it represented. Armstrong continued easing the spacecraft downward, watching for the shadow of Eagle's own landing legs against the dust-obscured surface, feeling for the moment of contact rather than seeing it directly through the swirling debris outside the window. Then, a light illuminated on the instrument panel. Contact. One of the probes extending below Eagle's footpads had touched the lunar surface, triggering the blue contact light exactly as engineers had designed it to. Armstrong shut down the descent engine immediately, as the procedure required, allowing the spacecraft to settle the final short distance onto its landing legs under the moon's own gravity, rather than risk the engine's exhaust kicking up debris against the descending footpads at the moment of touchdown. Eagle came to rest at 20 hours, 17 minutes, and 40 seconds, Coordinated Universal Time, on July 20th 1969, at a slight tilt of roughly 4.5 degrees, its 4 footpads settled into the ancient basaltic surface of the Sea of Tranquility. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Armstrong's voice reached Houston. "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." In the Mission Operations Control Room, the response was immediate, a mixture of applause and audible relief among flight controllers who had spent the better part of 13 minutes tracking a descent that had deviated further from its planned trajectory and consumed more of its fuel margin than almost any simulation had rehearsed. Capcom Charlie Duke, whose voice had relayed the fuel calls during the final tense seconds, replied with words that would later become almost as well remembered as Armstrong's own. "Roger, Tranquility, we copy you on the ground. You've got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again." Fuel remaining in Eagle's descent stage tanks, once the engine had shut down, amounted to somewhere between 25 and 45 seconds of burn time at the settings used during final approach, an uncomfortably thin margin arrived at only because Armstrong's manual search for a clear landing site had used propellant that the original flight plan had not accounted for. Inside the cabin, the immediate work was not celebration but procedure. Both astronauts ran through an abbreviated post-landing checklist, verifying that Eagle's systems remained stable and that the spacecraft was, in fact, safely and permanently settled rather than resting precariously on ground that might yet give way beneath it. Among the first tasks was a decision point built into the flight plan itself, whether to remain ready for an immediate emergency liftoff in case some undetected problem forced an abrupt abort, before committing to the longer, more complex sequence of preparing for a moonwalk. That readiness period passed without incident. Eagle's systems held steady. The ground beneath its footpads held steady. What had, only minutes earlier, been a spacecraft in freefall toward an unknown and only partially mapped landing site was now a vehicle at rest on the surface of another world, the first machine built by human hands ever to come to a stop there, its 2 occupants beginning the methodical, checklist-driven work of preparing to step outside it. Through Eagle's small triangular windows, the 2 astronauts got their first extended, motionless look at the terrain surrounding them. The view matched, in broad strokes, what orbital photographs and earlier robotic landers had suggested they might find: a gently rolling plain, pockmarked with craters ranging from barely perceptible depressions to pits several meters across, scattered with rocks of varying size, the entire landscape rendered in shades of gray and tan under a sky that, even in full daylight, remained absolutely black. There was no blue sky on the moon, and would never be one. Earth's sky appears blue because sunlight scatters off molecules in the atmosphere, with shorter blue wavelengths scattering more efficiently than longer red ones, filling the daytime sky with diffuse light from every direction. The moon has no atmosphere to scatter anything. Sunlight there travels in an unbroken straight line from source to surface, meaning that even in the brightest lunar daylight, looking away from the sun reveals nothing but the same black, star-filled void visible from space. The lack of atmosphere also meant an absence of anything resembling weather, wind, or erosion in any form familiar from Earth. Every rock, every crater rim, every fine particle of dust on the surface below Eagle's windows had arrived at its exact current position and shape through processes utterly different from the ones that shape landscapes on Earth. Not rain, not wind, not flowing water, but almost exclusively the slow accumulation of impacts, from massive ancient asteroid strikes down to microscopic dust grains arriving at cosmic velocities over billions of years. Communication with Houston during this period followed a steady rhythm of status checks and procedural confirmations, interspersed with brief moments where the enormity of what had just happened seemed to surface, however briefly, through otherwise clipped professional radio traffic. Flight controllers worked through their own checklists in parallel, verifying telemetry from Eagle's systems, confirming that consumables, oxygen, water, electrical power remained at levels sufficient to support the mission's next phase. Originally, the flight plan had called for a rest period before any surface excursion, giving both astronauts several hours of scheduled sleep inside Eagle's cramped cabin before undertaking the physically and mentally demanding work of a moonwalk. In the hours following touchdown, however, both Armstrong and Aldrin reported to Houston that neither felt inclined toward sleep. The adrenaline of the landing, combined with the sheer novelty of their circumstances, made the prospect of lying down for a scheduled rest period, mere hours after becoming the first human beings to land on another world, seem both impractical and, in a very human sense, almost beside the point. Mission Control agreed to move the moonwalk earlier in the timeline, and the crew began the lengthy process of preparing their spacesuits for use in the lunar vacuum. This was not a matter of simply putting on a suit. Each extravehicular mobility unit, as NASA formally called it, consisted of multiple pressurized layers designed to maintain a breathable internal atmosphere against the total vacuum outside, along with a separate backpack unit called the Portable Life Support System, providing oxygen, carbon dioxide removal, cooling water circulation, and radio communications independent of the spacecraft itself. Donning the suits inside Eagle's tiny cabin required a careful, almost choreographed sequence of movements, made more difficult by the confined space the two men shared, and by the simple physical bulk of the suits themselves once fully assembled. Every seal had to be checked. Every connection between the suit and its life support backpack had to be verified twice, sometimes 3 times, by both astronauts working together, since a single faulty seal could mean the difference between a functioning suit and a fatal decompression once the cabin itself was open to vacuum. Then came the moment the cabin's air had to leave. Eagle's hatch could not simply be opened while the cabin still held its internal atmosphere. The pressure difference between the pressurized cabin and the vacuum outside would have made the hatch impossible to move and dangerous to attempt. Instead, the crew slowly vented Eagle's cabin atmosphere out through a valve, watching a gauge tick down from full pressure towards 0. The final step separating the two men from an environment with no air at all, held back only by the suits now sealed around their bodies. With the cabin fully depressurized, Armstrong began the careful work of opening Eagle's outward opening hatch, a door barely large enough for a single suited astronaut to pass through at a time, in a cabin with almost no room to maneuver around it. Aldrin, from behind and below, guided the bulky life support backpack on Armstrong's suit clear of the hatch frame and instrument panel edges, calling out clearances as Armstrong worked his way, feet first, out onto the small porch outside Eagle's hatch. Below him, a ladder built into one of Eagle's 4 landing legs descended toward the surface, its rungs designed for a climb in 1/6 gravity, spaced and angled for a descent that would prove in practice considerably easier than the equivalent climb would have been on Earth. At the base of the ladder, before stepping onto the surface itself, Armstrong paused to describe what he could see to Houston and to the television audience now watching live through a black and white camera mounted on Eagle's descent stage, a camera that had been deployed specifically to capture this moment, unfolded and aimed by remote command from inside the cabin before Armstrong had even begun his climb down. The surface beneath the ladder's final rung, he reported, appeared to be a fine, powdery material, adhering lightly to the boots of his suit in a manner reminiscent, he noted, of fine charcoal powder. He described the descent down the ladder as easy, well within the design tolerances built into it by engineers who had never themselves stood on the surface they were designing for. Near the bottom, he paused once more on the ladder's lowest rung, still above the surface, to test how the lunar module's landing footpad had settled into the ground beneath it, pressing his boot against it, reporting back that it had depressed only a small distance into the surface material, offering the first direct, physical confirmation that the ground below would bear a human being's weight without giving way. Millions of kilometers of engineering analysis, robotic precursor missions, and careful trajectory planning had led to this single moment, one boot testing one small patch of ground on behalf of everyone who had built the machine that carried it there. The final step off the ladder brought both of Armstrong's boots onto the lunar surface itself at 2 hours 56 minutes and 15 seconds Coordinated Universal Time on July 21st, 1969. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. The words reached Houston, and from there relayed through a global network of tracking stations and television broadcast systems, an estimated audience of roughly 600 million people scattered across Earth, at the time the largest television audience in human history, watching a grainy black and white image of a suited figure descending a ladder onto a gray, cratered plain nearly 400,000 kilometers away. Standing on the surface, Armstrong began describing what he observed in careful, measured detail, a habit shaped by years of test pilot training that emphasized precise, unembellished reporting over any temptation toward dramatic narration. The fine-grained surface material, he noted, coated the soles and sides of his boots readily, though it required only the lightest brushing to remove. Below the thin layer of loose material lay a firmer surface, offering solid footing with each step. Movement in 1/6 gravity, he found, differed substantially from anything either astronaut had experienced during Earth-based training, even in the reduced gravity simulations designed to approximate it. Each step carried the body further and higher than instinct anticipated, requiring a conscious recalibration of balance and momentum that took several minutes of careful walking before it began to feel, in Armstrong's own later description, more natural. Roughly 20 minutes after Armstrong's first steps, Aldrin began his own careful descent down Eagle's ladder, pausing at points along the way to describe the process for the benefit of engineers on the ground, who would use these first-hand accounts to refine hatch and ladder designs for the 5 crewed landings still to follow. Reaching the surface, Aldrin turned to take in the full scene surrounding him for the first time, offering a description that would become, alongside Armstrong's own words, among the most quoted phrases of the entire mission, magnificent desolation. It was, in its way, a precisely accurate scientific description, as much as a poetic one. The landscape held a kind of stark, monumental beauty, framed against the total blackness of the lunar sky, and at the same time, it was a place utterly without life, without water, without wind, a plain of ancient volcanic rock and shattered fragments that had remained essentially unchanged for longer than complex life had existed on Earth. Before beginning the bulk of their scheduled work, both astronauts paused at a small stainless steel plaque mounted on one of Eagle's descent stage legs, permanently fixed in place and destined, like the rest of the descent stage, to remain on the surface forever. Armstrong read its inscription aloud for the benefit of the television audience listening back on Earth. Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969, AD. We came in peace for all mankind. Below the words sat 2 hemispheres of Earth and the signatures of the 3 astronauts alongside President Nixon's own. With both astronauts now standing on the surface together, the work of the moonwalk began in earnest, guided by a timeline planned months in advance and rehearsed repeatedly in simulations, though nothing in those simulations had fully prepared either man for how differently even simple tasks would feel under 1/6 gravity and inside a pressurized suit. One of their earliest tasks was collecting what mission planners called the contingency sample, a small quantity of lunar soil and rock, gathered quickly using a simple scoop and bag, and stowed securely in a pocket on Armstrong's suit before any other activity proceeded. The purpose was deliberately conservative. If some unforeseen problem forced an immediate, unplanned return to Eagle and an early end to the surface excursion, at least a small sample of the moon would already be secured and ready to bring home, rather than risk returning with nothing at all. It was the first material ever deliberately collected by human hands from another world. With the contingency sample secured, attention turned to a task that had occupied planning meetings back on Earth disproportionately to its scientific value, precisely because of its symbolic weight, raising an American flag on the lunar surface. The engineering problem was straightforward in principle and surprisingly difficult in practice. With no atmosphere and no wind on the moon, a flag hung from a simple vertical pole would droop lifelessly against its own staff, offering none of the visual drama a flag typically carries on Earth. The solution, designed months before launch, involved a horizontal telescoping rod sewn into the top edge of the flag itself, holding it extended outward in a fixed, permanent, unfurled position, regardless of the complete absence of any breeze to hold it there. Deploying this rod proved more difficult on the actual surface than it had in testing. The telescoping mechanism did not fully extend, leaving the flag with a slight permanent ripple across its fabric, an accidental detail that in the photographs taken moments later gave the flag an appearance of movement it did not actually possess. Driving the flagpole's base into the ground presented its own quiet difficulty. Beneath a thin layer of loose surface material, the astronauts encountered a much denser, more compacted layer that resisted the pole's insertion, allowing it to penetrate only a shallow distance before further pressure risked bending or damaging the pole itself. Photographs from the flag planting moment show Aldrin bracing the pole at an angle, working it carefully into ground that offered far less give than either astronaut had anticipated. Shortly after the flag was secured, Mission Control relayed word that President Richard Nixon wished to speak with the crew directly from the Oval Office, a call that Armstrong and Aldrin received while standing beside Eagle, the flag now fixed in the ground behind them. The conversation lasted only a few minutes, brief words exchanged across a distance that radio signals, traveling at the speed of light, still required well over a second to cross in each direction, a small physical reminder of scale, embedded even in the simplest exchange of pleasantries. With ceremonial obligations complete, the astronauts turned to the bulk of their scheduled scientific work, The tasks that had, in truth, justified the mission's cost and risk far more directly than any flag or phone call. Central to this work was a set of instruments, collectively designated the Early Apollo Scientific Experiments Package, deployed a short distance from Eagle on a flat stretch of ground selected to minimize interference from the lunar module's own presence. The first of these instruments, a passive seismometer, was designed to detect and record moonquakes, seismic vibrations traveling through the lunar interior, whose timing and character could reveal information about the moon's internal structure in much the same way seismographs on Earth reveal the structure of Earth's own crust and mantle. Unlike Earth, where seismic activity is driven largely by plate tectonics, the moon has no tectonic plates. Its seismic activity, scientists suspected even before this data existed, likely stemmed instead from tidal stresses caused by Earth's gravity, from meteorite impacts, and from the slow, ongoing contraction of the moon's interior as it continued cooling from its molten formation billions of years earlier. That seismometer would keep transmitting data for weeks after the astronauts themselves had returned home. A second instrument, a laser-ranging retroreflector, consisted of an array of 100 small, precisely angled mirrors called corner cube reflectors, arranged in a panel and mounted on a simple frame. Its function was elegantly passive. It required no power, no batteries, no ongoing maintenance of any kind, only the simple geometric property of a corner cube reflector, which returns any beam of light, striking it back in the exact direction from which it came, regardless of the angle of incidence. Observatories on Earth, using powerful lasers aimed at the reflector's precise coordinates, could measure the round-trip travel time of a laser pulse bounced off this array, calculating the Earth-Moon distance to a precision of just a few centimeters, an extraordinary level of accuracy for a distance of roughly 384,000 kilometers. This same reflector, along with similar ones left by later Apollo missions, remains in active use by observatories today, more than half a century after Armstrong and Aldrin set it in place, continuing to yield data on the moon's slow orbital drift away from Earth, a recession rate of roughly 3.8 centimeters per year, caused by the same tidal forces that raise ocean tides on Earth's own surface. A third instrument, a simple sheet of specialized aluminum foil mounted on a pole and angled toward the sun, collected solar wind particles, the continuous stream of charged particles, primarily protons and electrons, flowing outward from the sun at speeds often exceeding 400 kilometers per second. Deployed early in the moonwalk and retrieved near its end, the foil captured a sample of this particle stream that would later be analyzed in laboratories on Earth, offering direct physical evidence about the composition of the solar wind that no instrument on Earth's own surface, shielded as it is by the planet's magnetic field, could have gathered directly. Between instrument deployments, both astronauts worked through a documented geology sampling procedure, collecting rock and soil specimens from a range of locations near the landing site, photographing each sample's original position before collection, and noting its approximate composition and appearance for later cross-reference in Earth-based laboratories. The bulk sample collection process used a combination of tongs, scoops, and a specially designed rake to gather smaller fragments efficiently, working within the significant time constraints imposed by their limited oxygen supply and the physical fatigue that came from working inside a pressurized suit under the unfamiliar demands of lunar gravity. Among the collection tools was a hollow metal core tube, hammered directly into the surface to extract an undisturbed vertical column of regolith, roughly 13 centimeters deep, preserving the layering of the soil in a way that loose surface scoops could not. Armstrong drove 2 of these tubes into the ground near the end of the moonwalk, each one requiring more force than expected to penetrate the compacted material beneath the loose top layer, echoing the same resistance both astronauts had already encountered while working the flagpole into the ground earlier in the excursion. Every motion cost more effort than it would have on Earth, and every motion mattered more than almost any motion either man had made before. Photography occupied a substantial portion of the moonwalk's carefully budgeted time, using a chest-mounted Hasselblad camera that both astronauts operated largely without looking through a viewfinder, relying instead on trained muscle memory and a wide-angle lens forgiving enough to capture usable images even when framed somewhat imprecisely. These photographs of the lunar module, of footprints preserved in undisturbed regolith, of the deployed instruments, of Aldrin standing beside the American flag, would become, collectively, among the most reproduced images in the history of photography, documenting a landscape that had existed, essentially unchanged, for longer than any human institution, any written language, or any human civilization at all. The camera itself had been modified specifically for lunar use, stripped of its usual mirror and viewfinder assembly to reduce weight and simplify operation through a pressurized glove, and fitted with a specially reticulated glass plate inside that etched a grid of small crosses onto every frame, a fixed reference pattern engineers on Earth could later use to calculate precise distances and scales within each photograph, since no ruler or landmark of known size otherwise existed anywhere in frame. Of the roughly 120 photographs taken during the moonwalk, none included the astronaut operating the camera, by simple necessity. Armstrong appears in only a small handful of the surviving images, most of them reflected in the visor of Aldrin's helmet, rather than photographed directly. As the moonwalk approached its planned conclusion, Aldrin returned to Eagle first, climbing back up the ladder with the modest bulk of the mission's collected samples, and each man's own accumulated fatigue weighing more heavily than the mission timeline had entirely anticipated. Armstrong followed shortly after, pausing briefly at the base of the ladder for a final look across the plain before beginning his own climb back into the spacecraft that would, in less than a day, need to lift them both off the surface and back into lunar orbit. The total duration of the moonwalk, from Armstrong's first step to the moment the hatch closed behind them both, came to 2 hours and 31 minutes. A span of time that had required years of engineering, mathematics, and testing to make possible, and that had in its final minutes come down to 2 men working carefully and deliberately across a landscape neither of them nor anyone else had ever stood upon before. Inside the cabin once more, with the hatch resealed and cabin pressure slowly restored, both astronauts began the long process of removing their suits, securing the collected samples, and preparing for a period of rest that the mission timeline had, at last, genuinely arrived at. Outside Eagle's windows, the flag stood motionless in ground with no wind to move it. The footprints leading away from the ladder remained exactly as deep and exactly as sharp-edged as the moment each boot had lifted away from them, undisturbed and likely to remain that way in the absence of wind or rain or any other force capable of eroding them, for a span of time measured not in years, but in millions of them. The television camera that had carried these images back to Earth, mounted on Eagle's descent stage and unfolded by remote command before Armstrong's climb down the ladder, used a slow scan format incompatible with the standard broadcast television equipment of the era. Engineers on the ground solved this mismatch by pointing a conventional broadcast camera directly at a specially modified monitor displaying the incoming slow scan signal, converting one video format into another in real time, an imperfect but workable solution that accounts for the soft, grainy, high-contrast quality visible in the surviving footage, an aesthetic now inseparable from the public memory of the moment itself. The original slow scan tapes, recorded directly at the receiving stations before this conversion took place, would have preserved a substantially sharper image than the converted broadcast version millions of people actually watched that night. In the decades following the mission, a number of these original tapes went missing from NASA's own archives, reportedly reused or misplaced during a period when magnetic tape was an expensive, actively recycled resource rather than an item automatically preserved for historical value. Extensive searches conducted decades later failed to recover the original recordings, leaving the broadcast-converted footage as the primary surviving visual record of humanity's first steps on another world. The total mass of lunar material the two astronauts brought back into the cabin with them came to approximately 21.5 kilograms, gathered across dozens of individual samples ranging from fine soil to fist-sized rock fragments, each one cataloged and bagged according to its collection location and approximate context. Later analysis on Earth would reveal these samples to be predominantly basaltic in composition, chemically distinct in specific, measurable ways from basalt found on Earth, offering the first direct laboratory evidence supporting theories about the Moon's violent formation, billions of years earlier, from debris ejected by a colossal impact between the young Earth and a Mars-sized body, sometimes referred to by researchers as Theia. Before either astronaut could truly rest, a substantial amount of housekeeping remained. Every item that had traveled to the surface and back required stowage in specific locations within Eagle's already cramped cabin, a task complicated by the simple physical reality that two men in bulky suits, sharing a volume smaller than many household closets, had very little room to maneuver around each other or the equipment now filling every available surface. To reduce the mass Eagle's ascent stage would need to carry back into lunar orbit, a number of items used during the surface excursion were deliberately left behind on the Moon rather than brought back aboard. The boots, overshoes, portions of the life support backpacks no longer needed, cameras that had already captured their intended images, and other equipment whose continued presence aboard the spacecraft offered no further value against the fuel cost of carrying it further. These discarded items remain on the lunar surface today, scattered near Eagle's descent stage, part of a small debris field that has become, in the decades since, its own quiet historical record of the mission's final hours on the surface. With the cabin finally secured and both suits removed, Armstrong and Aldrin settled into the rest period the original flight plan had called for many hours earlier, though sleep inside Eagle's cabin proved, by both astronauts' later accounts, considerably harder to come by than the schedule assumed. The lunar module had not been designed with sleeping comfort as a significant priority. Its cabin offered no proper beds, only a combination of makeshift hammocks and the bare floor, illuminated by a persistent glow from indicator lights and instrument displays that neither astronaut had full control over dimming. Temperature inside the cabin, too, presented an unexpected discomfort. Eagle's cooling systems, designed primarily to manage heat generated by the spacecraft's own electronics and by the astronauts' physical exertion, left the cabin colder than either man found comfortable once the exertion of the moonwalk had ended, and both astronauts lay still, attempting to sleep. Neither reported getting more than a few scattered hours of genuine rest before the mission timeline called for them to begin preparations for the next, and in many ways most critical, phase of the mission still ahead, lifting off from the surface and finding their way back to Michael Collins, alone in orbit above them. Throughout this rest period, Eagle's descent stage remained exactly where it had touched down, its four legs still planted in the same undisturbed ground, its own onboard systems continuing to monitor cabin conditions even as its two occupants attempted, with limited success, to sleep. Above them, out of sight through Eagle's small windows during much of this period, Columbia continued its steady orbit, carrying Collins through his own long stretches of solitude and structured activity, each orbit bringing him closer, in time if not yet in physical proximity, to the moment his two crewmates would need to leave the surface and begin the delicate work of finding their way back to him. The ascent itself, still hours away, carried its own distinct engineering challenge, different in character from the descent that had preceded it. Eagle's ascent stage possessed only a single engine, non-throttleable, designed to fire exactly once, for exactly as long as necessary to lift the spacecraft off the descent stage, serving now as its launch platform, and to insert it directly into an orbit that would allow it to rendezvous with Columbia above. There would be no second attempt if this engine failed to ignite. There was no backup engine, no contingency built into the spacecraft's design beyond the assumption, tested and retested through years of engineering analysis, that this single system would perform exactly as intended when the moment came. Engineers had approached this single point of failure with a philosophy that ran throughout Eagle's entire design: reduce complexity wherever complexity itself became the greater risk. The ascent engine used hypergolic propellants, fuel and oxidizer that ignite spontaneously on contact with one another, requiring no separate ignition system, no spark, no additional mechanism that might itself fail at the critical moment. The moment the propellant valves opened, combustion began automatically, a design choice that traded away the flexibility of a more complex restartable engine in exchange for a level of reliability that mission planners judged, correctly, to matter more. During the rest period, ground controllers in Houston continued their own quiet work, tracking Columbia's orbit with mounting precision, refining the exact parameters Eagle's ascent would need to hit in order for the two spacecraft to find each other again above the lunar surface. This rendezvous problem, worked out mathematically years earlier and refined continuously throughout the mission, depended on a sequence of maneuvers not unlike a carefully choreographed dance performed across empty space, two spacecraft moving independently, needing to arrive at the same point in space, at the same moment, closing the final distance between them slowly enough to dock safely rather than collide. Buzz Aldrin's own doctoral research, completed years before he was selected as an astronaut, had focused directly on the mathematics underlying orbital rendezvous of exactly this kind, a field of study that had, at the time he pursued it, seemed almost abstract, theoretical work with no obvious immediate application. Now, lying in Eagle's cold, cramped cabin during a restless attempt at sleep, that same theoretical work stood between him and the difference between returning home and remaining stranded permanently on the surface of the moon. Neither astronaut voiced this possibility aloud during the rest period, though flight controllers on the ground and engineers who had spent years stress testing every system aboard both spacecraft understood the stakes with the same clarity the two men in Eagle's cabin did. The mission's design included no rescue capability of any kind. If Eagle's ascent engine failed to fire, or if the rendezvous calculations proved wrong in some way no one had anticipated, there existed no second spacecraft, no backup vehicle, no plan capable of reaching the two astronauts before their limited consumables ran out. That risk had been present since the moment Eagle separated from Columbia, quietly underlying every checklist item, every calculation, every hour of the mission that had followed. As the scheduled rest period drew to a close, both astronauts began working through the final preparatory checklist ahead of liftoff, verifying the ascent engine's propellant tanks were pressurized correctly, confirming the guidance computer had retained the alignment established earlier in the mission, and running through the sequence of switches and circuit breakers that would need to be activated in precise order at the moment of ignition. Outside, the flag remained standing, the footprints remained undisturbed, and the discarded equipment left behind on the surface sat exactly where it had been placed, in a stillness that would persist for millions of years after the two men now preparing to leave it had lived out their own far shorter human lifespans. Ahead lay the ascent itself, a single engine, firing once, carrying the smaller half of Eagle away from the larger half that would remain on the moon forever, back up toward an orbit where Michael Collins, alone aboard Columbia, waited to bring his crewmates home. At the appointed moment, Eagle's single ascent engine ignited. There was no countdown audible to anyone but the crew and mission control. No dramatic pause before ignition, only a computer-timed sequence executing precisely as programmed, firing a single engine that had never been tested in the exact conditions it now faced. 1/6 gravity, a vacuum with no atmosphere to complicate the exhaust plume, and a launch platform consisting of nothing more than the descent stage's own structure, left behind forever on the surface below. The ascent stage separated from the descent stage, using a set of explosive bolts and guillotine devices designed to sever every connecting cable, tube, and structural link in a fraction of a second, clean enough that the two halves of Eagle came apart without incident. Below, the descent stage stayed fixed in the ground where it had settled during the landing 3 days earlier, its 4 legs still planted in the lunar soil, the flag still standing beside it, the discarded equipment still scattered nearby, all of it now permanently anchored to a surface with no wind, no rain, and no future visitor for decades to come. The ascent stage climbed away from everything it left behind. Rising from the surface, the ascent stage's exhaust briefly scattered loose material outward from beneath it. Then rapidly, as altitude increased, that same exhaust plume dispersed into vacuum, leaving nothing to obscure the view from Eagle's small windows as the horizon began, subtly and then unmistakably, to curve. Inside the cabin, Armstrong and Aldrin monitored their ascent trajectory against a planned profile calculated to bring them into an orbit roughly 80 by 17 kilometers, an intentionally elliptical path designed to set up the specific sequence of rendezvous maneuvers that would follow over the next several hours. The ascent engine burned for approximately 7 minutes before shutting down automatically, its job complete, having carried the ascent stage from a standing start on the lunar surface to orbital velocity with a single, uninterrupted firing. What followed was less dramatic to watch and far more demanding mathematically, a careful sequence of smaller engine burns, using Eagle's own reaction control thrusters, gradually adjusting its orbit to match Columbia's, closing the physical distance between the two spacecraft, while also matching their velocities closely enough that a final docking approach could proceed safely. This was, in the most literal sense, the mathematics Buzz Aldrin had studied for his doctoral thesis years earlier, now unfolding in real time with his own life depending on its accuracy. Orbital rendezvous does not work the way intuition suggests. A spacecraft that simply points at its target and accelerates toward it will, counterintuitively, alter its own orbit in ways that carry it away from that target rather than toward it. Instead, rendezvous requires a sequence of precisely timed burns that adjust orbital altitude and phase separately, allowing the chasing spacecraft to gradually catch up along a curved, carefully calculated path rather than a straight line. In Houston, the flight controllers responsible for monitoring this phase of the mission occupied consoles arranged in tiered rows across the mission operations control room, each one tracking a different aspect of the spacecraft's status, trajectory, life support, electrical systems, guidance, communicating with one another through a dedicated internal audio loop that ran continuously beneath the more familiar radio traffic broadcast to the public. Decisions during rendezvous were rarely made by any single person acting alone. They emerged instead from a rapid, structured exchange among specialists, each cross-checking the other's numbers before any instruction was relayed up to the crew themselves. This layered redundancy, independent measurements aboard Eagle, independent measurements aboard Columbia, and independent verification from the ground reflected an engineering philosophy that had shaped nearly every system built for the mission. No single measurement, however carefully taken, was trusted entirely on its own. Confidence came instead from agreement between multiple, separately derived numbers, a discipline that traced back to the earliest planning stages of the entire Apollo program, and that had, by this point in the mission, already been tested and validated across days of critical maneuvers. Mission planners had also prepared for the possibility that Eagle's own guidance computer might fail entirely partway through the rendezvous sequence, an eventuality that would force Collins to fly an active manual rendezvous from Columbia instead, closing the distance using only his own onboard sextant and a set of backup charts prepared specifically for that scenario. This contingency, like so many others built into the mission, was never needed, but its existence reflected the same underlying pattern found throughout Apollo's design. For every critical system, a second independent path existed to reach the same outcome, even if that path required more manual skill and carried a narrower margin for error. None of this could be seen or felt directly, only trusted and verified number by number. Michael Collins, aboard Columbia, played an equally active role throughout this process, using the command module's own sextant and rendezvous radar to track Eagle's approach independently, cross-checking the numbers Eagle's own guidance computer was reporting against his own separate measurements. This redundancy existed by design. If either spacecraft's onboard systems produced an erroneous reading, the other spacecraft's independent tracking offered a critical second source of truth, one that had been built into the mission architecture specifically because a rendezvous conducted entirely on the strength of a single spacecraft's instruments left too little margin for error. In the final hours before Eagle's approach, Collins had also worked through a private mental exercise of his own, reviewing again and again the specific sequence of actions he would need to take if Eagle failed to dock successfully or failed to reach orbit at all. He later described running through these contingencies not out of pessimism, but simply as thorough preparation, the same instinct that had shaped every hour of training leading up to the mission. Understand the failure before it happens, so that if it does, there is no hesitation left to overcome. Over the following 3.5 hours, Eagle closed the distance to Columbia in careful stages, each burn bringing the two spacecraft closer, while Mission Control in Houston monitored the numbers relayed from both vehicles, ready to advise on corrections if the trajectory drifted outside acceptable limits. As the final approach began, Collins could see Eagle directly through Columbia's windows for the first time since the two spacecraft had separated 3 days earlier. A small, oddly shaped craft, its gold foil thermal insulation catching sunlight against the black background of space, growing steadily larger as the remaining distance closed to a few hundred meters, then a few dozen, then only a handful. Docking itself required a precision similar to the one Collins had demonstrated days earlier when he first connected Columbia to Eagle in Earth orbit, though this time the stakes carried an added weight. Any failure here, with Eagle's own limited propellant reserves and no descent stage remaining to fall back on, would leave Armstrong and Aldrin with no viable path home. Watching his alignment cues closely, Collins eased the two spacecraft's docking mechanisms together at a closing rate measured in mere centimeters per second, the 12 capture latches snapping shut automatically the instant contact registered, locking Columbia and Eagle into a single rigid structure once again. The three men were together again for the first time in over a day. What followed was a careful transfer process, moving the collected lunar samples, exposed film, and other critical equipment from Eagle into Columbia through the narrow pressurized passage joining the two spacecraft, along with the two astronauts themselves, still in their suits, working through the cramped crawl space, one item and one person at a time. Once the transfer was complete and both hatches sealed, Eagle's ascent stage, its fuel largely exhausted, its purpose entirely fulfilled, was jettisoned, released to drift on its own trajectory, eventually impacting the lunar surface at a location that mission planners deliberately chose to be far enough from the Apollo 11 landing site to avoid contaminating any future scientific study of the area. With all three astronauts now reunited aboard Columbia, and Eagle's remaining hardware sent on its own separate path, the crew turned their full attention toward the journey home. Columbia remained in lunar orbit for several more hours, allowing time for additional photography of the surface below and for the crew to rest briefly before the burn that would decide the shape of everything still ahead. Trans-Earth injection, the maneuver that would break Columbia free of lunar orbit entirely and send it falling back toward Earth. That burn, like the lunar orbit insertion burn days earlier, would need to occur on the far side of the moon, beyond radio contact with Houston, executed and confirmed entirely on the strength of the spacecraft's own onboard systems. There was no possibility of ground intervention if something went wrong during those critical minutes. Whatever happened would happen while Earth itself sat blocked from view, its own gravity waiting, 3 days distant, to receive the crew back into its influence. The trans-Earth injection burn lasted just under 2.5 minutes, firing Columbia's main engine, the same service propulsion system engine that had earlier slowed the spacecraft into lunar orbit, in the opposite configuration, accelerating rather than decelerating, pushing the combined mass of the command and service module up to a velocity sufficient to escape the moon's gravitational influence and begin the long fall back toward home. When Columbia's radio signal reappeared on schedule as it emerged from behind the moon, Mission Control in Houston confirmed, once again, that the burn had succeeded precisely as planned. Ahead lay a journey of roughly 3 days, largely a mirror image of the outbound trip, though carrying now a very different cargo, 21.5 kilograms of lunar material, rolls of exposed film documenting sights no human camera had ever recorded, and 3 astronauts whose physical and mental reserves had been drawn down considerably further than the outbound leg of the mission had required. The spacecraft resumed its slow, continuous rotation, the same passive thermal control role used during the outbound journey, distributing the sun's heat evenly across Columbia's hull rather than allowing one side to bake while the other froze. Inside the cabin, a quieter rhythm settled in, punctuated by scheduled status reports to Houston, periods of rest, and the ongoing work of securing samples and equipment for the re-entry and splashdown still to come. Michael Collins, whose own solitary vigil in lunar orbit had ended once Eagle successfully docked, now shared the return journey's routine tasks with his 2 crewmates, the 3 of them once again occupying the same cramped volume that had carried them outbound days earlier, though the mood aboard had shifted in ways that transcended the numbers on any instrument panel. What had been, on the outbound leg, a journey toward genuine uncertainty had become, on the return, a journey toward a homecoming that still required, and would continue to require until the very last moments, precise execution of a great many remaining steps. The stars outside Columbia's windows had not changed at all. They held the same fixed, unblinking positions they had held on the outbound journey, indifferent to what had happened in the days between, indifferent to 2 men who had walked where no one had ever walked, and to a flag left standing where no wind would ever move it again. The physics governing Columbia's fall back toward Earth remained the same physics that had carried it outward, a spacecraft in free fall, subject only to gravity, tracing a curved path determined entirely by its velocity and position at the moment of the trans-Earth injection burn. As the return trip progressed, the balance of gravitational influence once again began its slow, imperceptible shift, Earth's pull growing steadily stronger relative to the moon's, the spacecraft's fall, accelerating not because any engine fired again, but simply because Earth's much greater mass exerted a correspondingly greater gravitational pull as the distance between them closed. One further mid-course correction burn, a brief firing of Columbia's smaller reaction control thrusters, refined the spacecraft's trajectory partway through the return journey, adjusting the angle at which Columbia would eventually meet Earth's atmosphere. That angle mattered enormously. Too shallow, and the spacecraft would skip off the atmosphere entirely, like a stone skipped across water, flung back out into space on a trajectory with no plan and no supplies to survive it. Too steep, and the deceleration forces of re-entry, along with the heat generated by atmospheric friction, would exceed what either the spacecraft's heat shield or the astronauts' own bodies could withstand. The safe corridor between those 2 failure modes measured only a few degrees wide out of a full range of possible re-entry angles, a narrow target that Columbia's guidance system, refined continuously through tracking data from Earth, was now steering toward with a precision built from years of orbital mechanics calculations, tested first in simulation, and now, for the second time in the mission, being trusted with 3 human lives riding on its accuracy. Throughout the return journey, Houston's tracking network continued refining its picture of Columbia's exact trajectory, using radio signals bounced between ground antennas and the spacecraft's own transponder to measure velocity and position with steadily increasing precision as the distance to Earth closed. Each measurement fed back into an evolving prediction of exactly where and exactly when Columbia would meet the outer edge of Earth's atmosphere, a calculation that had to account not only for the spacecraft's own motion, but for the rotation of the Earth itself beneath the point where re-entry would eventually occur. Inside the cabin, the astronauts used what limited spare time remained to prepare a brief broadcast reflecting on the mission, transmitted back to Earth during one of the return journey's calmer stretches. Collins spoke first, followed by Aldrin, and then Armstrong, each offering a short set of remarks acknowledging the scale of the engineering effort behind the flight, the hundreds of thousands of engineers, technicians, and specialists across the country whose individual contributions had collectively made the mission possible, most of whom would never travel to space themselves, and whose names would never appear in any headline about it. Somewhere in the hours ahead, the crew would separate the command module from the service module that had carried them since launch, discarding an entire section of the spacecraft that had, until that point, provided power, propulsion, and life support throughout the mission. What remained, the command module alone, a cone-shaped capsule barely large enough for the 3 astronauts and their most essential equipment, would be the only piece of the enormous 3,000-ton machine that had left Earth 9 days earlier, destined to return to it intact. The pace of the mission, which had built steadily toward the landing and then held taut through the tension of the ascent and rendezvous, began, in these final hours before re-entry, to settle into something quieter. There was less left to decide, less left to calculate freshly, and more simply to trust. Trust in a heat shield designed years earlier, trust in parachutes packed and inspected long before launch, trust in an ocean recovery fleet already moving into position thousands of kilometers away to meet a capsule that had not yet even reached the edge of Earth's atmosphere. Ahead lay re-entry itself, a plunge through Earth's atmosphere at a velocity of nearly 40,000 kilometers per hour, the fastest speed any human being had ever traveled, followed by parachutes, and then, if every calculation held, the quiet, rolling surface of the Pacific Ocean. Inside the cabin during these final hours, the astronauts worked through checklists that would by now have felt almost familiar after 9 days of near-continuous procedure, verifying switch positions, confirming the guidance computer's re-entry program was correctly loaded, securing loose items throughout the cabin against the violent deceleration still to come. Outside, Earth had grown from a small blue point of light back into something that filled an increasing portion of the window, its clouds and coastlines slowly resolving into recognizable shapes as the distance continued to close. The command module's heat shield, a blunt, rounded surface covering the entire base of the cone-shaped capsule, had been designed to manage one of re-entry's central problems, the enormous kinetic energy of a spacecraft moving at nearly 11 kilometers per second, all of which had to be converted into heat and safely dissipated before the capsule reached the ground. Rather than attempting to insulate against this heat directly, the shield used a technique called ablation, a specially formulated material that charred, melted, and vaporized in a controlled manner as re-entry progressed, carrying enormous quantities of heat away from the capsule's structure, along with the material itself as it burned off. Temperatures at the heat shield's outer surface during peak re-entry heating reached approximately 2,760 degrees Celsius, hot enough to ionize the surrounding air into a layer of plasma dense enough to block all radio communication with the ground for several minutes, a communications blackout built into the physics of re-entry itself, distinct from the earlier blackouts caused by the moon's own bulk, but no less absolute while it lasted. For those minutes, nothing could be heard from the capsule at all. Flight controllers in Houston and the recovery ships already stationed in the Pacific could do nothing during this blackout period but wait for the moment when re-entry heating would ease enough for the surrounding plasma to dissipate and radio contact to resume, a wait that, for a mission that had already survived a landing with critically low fuel and a rendezvous with no backup plan, had become almost routine in its own particular kind of tension. When Columbia's radio signal reappeared, the capsule had already slowed dramatically, the worst of the re-entry heating behind it, its velocity dropping from the blistering speed of atmospheric entry down towards something parachutes could safely manage. At an altitude of roughly 7 kilometers, a set of small drogue parachutes deployed first, stabilizing the capsule's orientation and slowing it further before the 3 large main parachutes, each nearly 25 meters across when fully inflated, opened in sequence to bring Columbia's final descent rate down to a survivable speed. Columbia struck the surface of the Pacific Ocean at 1650 Coordinated Universal Time on July 24, 1969, roughly 1,300 kilometers southwest of Hawaii. Its descent slowed to a gentle enough speed by the 3 main parachutes that the impact itself felt, by the crew's own later description, comparable to a moderately rough landing in an aircraft. The capsule briefly settled into an inverted position in the water, floating apex down before a set of inflatable bags built into its structure activated automatically, rolling it back upright within a few minutes. Nearby, the aircraft carrier USS Hornet, positioned in advance along the calculated splashdown zone, already had recovery helicopters in the air and had watched the capsule's final descent through binoculars and telephoto lenses from a distance of only a few kilometers. After 9 days, the ocean had received them. What followed was not in fact the triumphant, unguarded arrival that television audiences watching at home might have imagined. Since the earliest planning stages of the mission, NASA had carried a quiet, persistent concern, the possibility, considered unlikely but not impossible, that the lunar surface might harbor some form of microbial life capable of posing a biological risk to Earth's own ecosystem once exposed to it. No such life had ever been detected by any instrument, on Earth or in orbit, but the absence of evidence, mission planners had judged, was not sufficient grounds to skip precautions entirely. As a result, recovery divers approaching the floating capsule wore biological isolation garments before opening the hatch, and the 3 astronauts, upon exiting, immediately donned similar protective suits themselves, sealing off any direct contact between their bodies and the open ocean air around them. A life raft carried the crew, still suited, to a waiting helicopter, which transported them not to a celebratory welcome on the Hornet's open deck, but directly into a small, sealed trailer called the Mobile Quarantine Facility, a converted Airstream camper modified with its own filtered air supply and sealed entryways, parked securely inside the carrier's hangar bay. Inside that trailer, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins would remain isolated for the better part of 3 weeks, joined eventually by a small support team of physicians and technicians, while the entire structure was later transported, still sealed, first by ship and then by aircraft, back to a specially built quarantine laboratory at the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston. The mobile quarantine facility itself measured barely 9 meters in length, its interior divided into a small kitchen, a lounge area, and sleeping berths sufficient for the crew and the handful of support staff who joined them inside the sealed environment. Air leaving the trailer passed through filtration designed to capture any biological material before release, while anyone approaching from outside did so only through a carefully controlled airlock, minimizing any possibility of contact between the sealed interior and the unfiltered world beyond it. For three astronauts who had, only days earlier, walked across the surface of another world in near total isolation from any other living thing, the quarantine period offered a strange kind of continuity, trading one enclosed, carefully monitored environment for another, still separated from ordinary human contact, even as reporters, well-wishers, and eventually the president himself gathered just outside a pane of glass they could not yet cross. Their first hours back on Earth were spent, quite literally, still separated from it. The quarantine period, lasting 21 days in total, produced no evidence of any biological hazard whatsoever, no unusual organisms, no unexplained illness, nothing beyond the ordinary. The precaution, though it ultimately proved unnecessary, reflected an underlying scientific caution that had shaped much of the mission's planning from the very beginning, an insistence on accounting for possibilities that were unlikely, rather than assuming, without direct evidence, that they could simply be dismissed. On the day of splashdown itself, President Nixon greeted the crew in person, though even this greeting had to accommodate the quarantine protocol still in effect. Aboard the USS Hornet, the president spoke with all three astronauts through a plate glass window built into the side of the mobile quarantine facility, close enough to see their faces clearly, but separated by a barrier that would remain in place for another 3 weeks. News of the successful landing and safe return had already reached an audience spanning much of the globe, relayed through a network of television broadcasts, radio transmissions, and newspaper coverage that made Apollo 11, by most measures, the most widely witnessed event in human history up to that point. In the days following their release from quarantine, the three astronauts embarked on an extended public tour, visiting dozens of countries across 6 continents, greeted in each city by crowds that, in several cases, numbered in the millions. For a brief span of weeks, nearly the entire world had watched the same sky and wondered about the same question. Ticker tape parades in New York and Chicago drew crowds estimated at several million people each, a scale of public gathering rarely matched before or since for any single event. The astronauts' own accounts of this period often noted a peculiar contrast, having spent the most consequential hours of their lives in near total isolation, first on the lunar surface and then inside quarantine. They emerged into some of the largest, most concentrated crowds any human being had ever addressed directly. While the crew toured and the public celebrated, the samples themselves, the full 21.5 kilograms Armstrong and Aldrin had carried home, began an entirely separate and far less public scientific journey of their own, distributed among laboratories around the world, subjected to chemical analysis, radiometric dating, and detailed physical examination. These samples would go on to reshape scientific understanding of the moon's origin, composition, and history in ways that no telescope, however powerful, had ever been able to achieve from a distance of 384,000 kilometers. Radiometric dating of the returned samples placed the age of the moon's oldest rocks at over 4 billion years, older than nearly any rock ever found on Earth's own, constantly recycled, tectonically active surface. The chemical composition of the samples, compared carefully against Earth's own mantle rock, provided strong supporting evidence for the giant impact hypothesis, the theory that the moon formed from debris ejected when a Mars-sized body collided with the young Earth early in the solar system's history, fusing the two worlds' compositions together in ways still measurable, faintly, in rock collected nearly 4.5 billion years later. For decades, Scientific consensus held that the lunar samples were essentially bone dry, containing no meaningful trace of water at all, a conclusion drawn from the analytical instruments available in 1969 and the years immediately following. Only decades later, as measurement technology improved considerably, did researchers re-examine small portions of the original Apollo 11 samples using instruments capable of detecting far smaller quantities of water than earlier equipment could resolve. That later reanalysis, conducted in the early 21st century, revealed trace amounts of water bound within tiny volcanic glass beads scattered through the lunar soil, a finding that quietly overturned decades of assumption and that would not have been possible without samples collected, cataloged, and carefully preserved since the very day Armstrong and Aldrin brought them aboard Eagle. Roughly 3/4 of the original Apollo 11 samples remain in storage today, untouched since their return, deliberately set aside so that future generations of scientists, equipped with instruments and questions no one in 1969 could have anticipated, would have fresh material to work with. The remaining quarter has been gradually allocated in carefully measured portions to research institutions and museums around the world, including small fragments gifted as goodwill tokens to more than 135 countries, along with all 50 American states, in the years immediately following the mission. The instruments left behind on the surface continued their own quiet work long after the astronauts themselves had returned home and completed their quarantine. The passive seismometer transmitted data for weeks, recording the moon's subtle seismic activity and contributing to a scientific picture of a world whose interior, unlike Earth's, had grown mostly cold and rigid, its remaining seismic events driven not by shifting tectonic plates, but by tidal stress, meteorite impacts, and the slow, ongoing contraction of a body still settling, incrementally, toward equilibrium. The laser-ranging retroreflector proved to be the longest-lived of all the instruments left at Tranquility Base. More than half a century after Aldrin set it in place, observatories on Earth continue to bounce laser pulses off its array of corner cube mirrors, measuring the Earth-Moon distance with a precision now refined to mere millimeters, and confirming, through decades of accumulated measurements, that the Moon continues drifting away from Earth at a rate of roughly 3.8 centimeters per year. The same tidal forces that raise ocean tides on Earth slowly, patiently, pushing its only natural satellite farther away, one measured fraction of a centimeter at a time. In, out. None of the instruments left on the surface required maintenance. None of them ever would. They remained, silent and unattended, on a plane that had already existed for billions of years before human beings evolved to look up and wonder about it, and that would continue existing for billions more, largely unchanged long after every trace of the mission's builders had passed from living memory. The global network of tracking stations built to support Apollo, the same large dish antennas in California, Spain, and Australia that had relayed Armstrong's voice across 250,000 kilometers of space, did not retire once the program ended. That infrastructure evolved directly into what became known as the Deep Space Network, the same system still used today to communicate with robotic spacecraft scattered across the solar system, from orbiters circling Mars to probes that have long since passed beyond the outer planets entirely. Much of the software and engineering discipline developed to guide Apollo's guidance computer, too, outlived the program that produced it. The rigorous approach to error handling and fault tolerance, pioneered by Margaret Hamilton's team at MIT, influenced software engineering practices well beyond spaceflight, in fields as varied as commercial aviation and, decades later, computing systems that touch daily life in ways the original Apollo engineers could scarcely have anticipated. Apollo 11's success opened the door to 5 further crewed lunar landings over the following 3.5 years, each one building on lessons learned from the flight that came before it, expanding the range and duration of surface exploration until Apollo 17, the final mission of the program, spent over 3 days on the lunar surface in December of 1972, a stay more than 3 times longer than Armstrong and Aldrin's original 21.5 hours. 2 further missions, Apollo 18 and Apollo 19, had been planned and were already well into hardware production before budget reductions in the early 1970s led NASA to cancel them, redirecting the Saturn V rockets originally built for those flights toward other purposes instead. One of the canceled program's spare Saturn V rockets, fully assembled but never launched, remains on public display today, lying on its side at a visitor center in Florida, the closest most people will ever come to standing beside the actual machine that once carried human beings to another world. Since Apollo 17 departed the moon, no human being has returned to its surface. In, out. For more than 50 years, the record set by that final mission has stood, a gap in human spaceflight history that current lunar programs, decades later, are only now working to close. The footprints Armstrong and Aldrin left in the Sea of Tranquility remain there still, undisturbed by wind that does not exist, unwashed by rain that has never fallen, preserved in exactly the shape 2 human boots pressed into ancient volcanic dust on a July night in 1969. Somewhere above, in an orbit no longer occupied by any spacecraft, the quiet arithmetic of gravity continues exactly as it always has, indifferent to the footprints below, indifferent to the flag still standing where no one placed a hand to steady it again, indifferent to the immense, careful human effort that once briefly reached across the dark and touched another world. The command module, Columbia itself, the only piece of the original 3,000-ton Saturn V stack to return intact to Earth, now rests in a museum, its heat-scarred exterior preserved exactly as re-entry left it, a blunt, blackened cone, small enough that visitors are often surprised to learn 3 grown men once spent 9 days living inside it. Neil Armstrong lived for another 43 years after the mission, largely avoiding the public spotlight that his own achievement had made almost impossible to escape entirely. He taught engineering at a university in Ohio for a time, served on investigative boards following later spaceflight accidents, and rarely gave interviews about the walk that had made him, whether he sought it or not, one of the most recognized human beings alive. Buzz Aldrin, by contrast, became one of spaceflight's most visible and outspoken advocates in the decades that followed, writing books, appearing publicly, and continuing to push, well into his 80s, for renewed human exploration of both the Moon and Mars, a persistence rooted, perhaps, in the same rendezvous mathematics he had once treated as pure theory and had later trusted with his own life. Even the mission's own emblem, designed months before launch, quietly reflected this same instinct toward restraint. Rather than showing the 3 astronauts' names, as earlier Apollo patches had, the crew chose to depict only a bald eagle descending toward the lunar surface, an olive branch held in its talons as a symbol of peaceful intent, with Earth rising small and distant in the background, a design the crew felt spoke for the entire effort behind the mission, rather than for the 3 men who happened to fly it. Michael Collins, who spent the mission's most consequential hours farther from another human being than anyone in history before him, described his own role with characteristic understatement in the years that followed, noting simply that the view of Earth from lunar orbit, small and blue, and entirely alone against the black, had changed the way he understood the planet he was returning to. Each of the 12 human beings who eventually walked on the moon across 6 separate Apollo landings returned to Earth carrying some version of this same altered perspective, a shift in scale that few other human experiences, before or since, have been able to offer. In the years since, spacecraft equipped with cameras far more capable than anything available in 1969 have photographed the Apollo 11 landing site from lunar orbit, resolving Eagle's discarded descent stage, the long shadow it casts across the regolith, and even the faint trail of disturbed ground marking the astronauts' short walk away from it and back. Those images, taken from altitudes of only a few dozen kilometers, confirm what physics alone had already predicted. Nothing meaningful has changed. The same footprints, the same flag, though its colors, exposed for decades to unfiltered solar radiation with no atmosphere to soften it, have likely faded to white by now, bleached by a level of ultraviolet and cosmic exposure no fabric on Earth's surface ever experiences. No one has confirmed the flag's current color directly. No return mission has passed close enough or been tasked with the specific purpose of finding out. It remains for now one of the small, quiet uncertainties left behind by a mission otherwise defined by precision, a single unanswered detail waiting in the stillness of the sea of tranquility for some future visitor to finally check. It is worth pausing on just how strange that fact really is. A species capable of calculating a rendezvous orbit to within centimeters, of landing a spacecraft on another world with seconds of fuel to spare, has still not managed a simple, direct answer to a question as ordinary as what color a piece of fabric has faded to after half a century in vacuum. The gap between those two kinds of knowledge, the extraordinary precision of the mission itself, and the small, mundane uncertainties left in its wake, says something quiet about exploration in general, that reaching a place is never quite the same as fully knowing it, and that even the most carefully documented journey leaves behind loose threads for someone else, someday, to follow. The Sea of Tranquility itself remains exactly as it was left. No dust storm has buried the footprints. No rainfall has softened their edges. No plant has grown across the disturbed ground where Eagle's descent engine kicked lunar soil outward in every direction during the final seconds before touchdown. In the complete absence of atmosphere, of weather, of any biological process at all, the marks left by 2 astronauts and 1 spacecraft across 2.5 hours of careful, deliberate work will likely remain recognizable for a span of time longer than human civilization itself has yet existed, a permanence almost impossible to hold in mind, and one that the moon, silent and airless, simply carries without effort, the way it has carried every other mark left on its surface for over 4 billion years. If tonight's story is the kind that finds its way to you on nights when sleep comes slowly, a subscription to quiet science at bedtime helps more than you might expect. It helps this channel keep bringing real science, told slowly, to more people who need exactly this kind of quiet. A like and a moment to turn on notifications means we can find you again the next time a story like this one is ready. Everything you heard tonight is real. The footprints at Tranquility Base are out there right now. Sleep well. Good night.